The imposing structure of the Alameda County Superior Courthouse in Oakland, California, stood as a formidable monument against the downtown skyline. Its classical columns and broad granite steps were intended as symbols of the unwavering solidity of justice itself. Deep within its hallowed halls, Judge Theodore Vance occupied a spacious chamber, paneled in rich, dark California walnut. The large windows offered a commanding, panoramic view over Frank H. Ogawa Plaza, a vista of civic order that mirrored the judge's own cultivated public image. He was an impressive figure, possessed of an undeniable gravitas, a man whose pronouncements carried immense weight, whose reputation had been meticulously constructed over decades to appear utterly flawless. Years dedicated to the bench, a history of carefully reasoned decisions, and the profound respect of his peers and the wider community all contributed to this facade of unshakable moral integrity. His life, much like his office, was a study in controlled order. Meticulously arranged, profoundly respectable, undeniably expensive. His residence was a sprawling house nestled in the exclusive, leafy enclave of Piedmont, a bastion of quiet wealth and privilege. His social calendar was punctuated by regular, high-profile charity dinners where his presence lent an air of sober importance. He was frequently mentioned, always favorably, in the pages of the Oakland Tribune, held up as a paragon of judicial fairness and unwavering professionalism. Yet beneath the gleaming polish of his mahogany desk, and behind the heavy, light-filtering drapes that muted the bright glare off the bay, existed a deep, hidden fracture. A secret facet of his existence, carefully concealed, held the potential to violently shatter his meticulously crafted world in an instant. Several times each week, Judge Vance would orchestrate departures from this gilded cage, slipping away for clandestine meetings held far from the prying eyes of the public and the ever-present lenses of the media. These assignations took place in carefully chosen locales designed for anonymity. Sometimes it was an unassuming apartment tucked away in a less scrutinized neighborhood of East Oakland, rented under an assumed name, its anonymity a stark contrast to the opulence of his Piedmont home. Other times, refuge was sought in the quiet, secluded corners of the nearby Redwood Regional Park, amidst the towering ancient trees that offered a natural screen from observation. These were the places where he met Simone Dubois. She was young, vibrant, possessed of an energy that stood in sharp relief to the staid, regimented world he inhabited. Their connection was a perilous game played dangerously close to the edge, an illicit thrill that provided a jolt of adrenaline missing from his life, a life otherwise measured out in legal briefs and procedural decorum. In her company, he experienced a fleeting sense of rejuvenation, a temporary liberation from the constraints of his position and his age. But this feeling was always intertwined with the chilling grip of fear, the constant, low-level dread of exposure. The mere thought of discovery sent icy tendrils through his veins. Every secret meeting was a precarious walk along a precipice. Every stolen glance, every hushed conversation carried the potential for ruin. The twilight of his distinguished career seemed a distant prospect. The sun of his public acclaim still appeared to shine brightly, yet insidious shadows had already begun to lengthen at the periphery of his carefully ordered universe, threatening to engulf everything he had built. He was a man balanced on a knife's edge, the weight of his secrets pressing down, making the eventual fall seem not just possible, but perhaps inevitable. Elias Vance, the judge's sole heir, moved through his world just across the bay at the University of California, Berkeley, with an easy grace. He possessed a sharp intellect matched by a natural charm that drew people to him, making him a popular figure on campus. His life unfolded with the vibrant, sometimes chaotic energy typical of ambitious students. A whirlwind of challenging coursework, engaging seminars, late-night study sessions, casual parties, and the optimistic forging of plans for a future he assumed would be bright and successful. He navigated this world entirely unaware of the hidden currents pulling at his father's carefully constructed existence, oblivious to the secret life Theodore Vance guarded so fiercely. Fate, however, weaves its threads with an often cruel indifference to human plans. In a turn that would prove catastrophic, Elias's path intersected with Simone Dubois'. The exact circumstances were mundane, lost in the blur of youthful socializing, Perhaps it was at a crowded off-campus party in Oakland, hosted by mutual acquaintances, or maybe a chance encounter at a popular Berkeley cafe. The specific details mattered little compared to the undeniable spark that ignited between them almost immediately. An easy rapport developed, fueled by shared interests and mutual attraction. What began as casual flirtation soon deepened into something more significant, blossoming into a genuine relationship, marked by the hopeful intensity of new love. Unwittingly, or perhaps through a calculated omission, Simone found herself positioned precariously at the apex of an invisible, dangerous triangle. She was intimately connected to both the distinguished father and his unsuspecting son, a complex entanglement unknown to either man for a considerable time. Subtle, almost imperceptible shifts began to register on Judge Theodore Vance's finely tuned senses. He started noticing things, small inconsistencies that pricked at his awareness. There were casual mentions of Simone's name dropped into infrequent phone conversations with Elias, spoken with a warmth that felt slightly unfamiliar. During his own clandestine meetings with Simone, he detected a new, underlying tremor of nervousness beneath her usual composure, a fleeting anxiety in her eyes that hadn't been there before. He sensed a slight withdrawal, an almost imperceptible emotional distance growing between them. Cold, unsettling suspicions, like the persistent chill of the San Francisco Bay fog, began to creep into the corners of his mind. He tried to dismiss them forcefully, attributing these feelings to his own heightened anxiety, the inherent stress of maintaining his double life, perhaps even a touch of possessiveness he wouldn't admit to. He reasoned that his fear was making him see shadows where none existed, but the gnawing unease refused to dissipate entirely. Then came the revelation that shattered his attempts at self-deception, confirming his deepest fears. Simone was pregnant. The news landed not with the quiet weight of consequence, but with the shocking force of a thunderclap directly overhead, leaving him momentarily stunned and reeling. The unspoken, terrifying question of the child's paternity immediately hung heavy and suffocating in the air between them. It was an accusation, a potential catastrophe embodied in a life yet to begin. His mind flashed back, searching, connecting disparate observations. He recalled seeing Elias and Simone together weeks earlier at a crowded outdoor festival near Lake Merritt. He had initially dismissed it as a chance encounter between his son and a casual acquaintance. Now, however, the memory replayed with horrifying clarity. Their easy laughter, the comfortable way Elias had slung an arm around her shoulder, the unmistakable look of shared intimacy in their eyes. It was not the interaction of strangers or mere friends. A sickening, icy premonition constricted his chest, the vague suspicion solidifying into a terrifying probability. The intricate clockwork of his carefully managed life had been irrevocably disrupted. A destructive mechanism had been set in motion, and the bomb placed beneath the foundations of his career, his family, and his entire identity was now ticking, louder and more insistently with each passing day, counting down to unavoidable ruin. The inevitable arrived, crashing down with the brutal finality he had dreaded with every fiber of his being. The precise mechanism hardly mattered, whether it was Simone herself, finally unable to bear the crushing weight of the deceit and the suffocating uncertainty, who tearfully confessed the truth during one of their fraught, clandestine meetings, or perhaps, more clinically, it was the stark, irrefutable result of a DNA test, procured secretly through channels his position afforded him, the cold black and white report landing on his polished desk like a verdict, obliterating his last vestiges of desperate hope. The outcome was the same, immutable and catastrophic. The father of the unborn child was Elias Vance, his son, his own flesh and blood. For Judge Theodore Vance, this confirmation was not mere news. It was the pronouncement of a sentence, absolute and without possibility of appeal. In that single devastating moment, the entire intricate scaffolding of his meticulously constructed world buckled and collapsed inward. The carefully balanced pillars of his reputation, his career, his family life, all disintegrated simultaneously. Vivid, terrifying images flooded his mind with sickening clarity. He saw the lurid, sensational headlines splashed across the front pages of the Oakland Tribune, the San Francisco Chronicle, perhaps even national news outlets. He imagined the barely concealed smirks and hushed, humiliating whispers echoing behind his back in the hallowed, familiar corridors of the courthouse. He pictured the utter devastation on his wife's face, the irreparable shattering of their carefully maintained domestic facade, the angry incomprehension and eventual estrangement from the community he had served and commanded respect from for so long. He saw the immediate, ignominious end of his distinguished judicial career, the gavel falling not in judgment of others, but upon the wreckage of his own life. He felt the suffocating weight of indelible public shame, a stain that no amount of past accomplishment could ever erase. Everything he had painstakingly built over decades, his influence, his standing, the very essence of his public identity, felt poised to dissolve into worthless dust, all sacrificed on the altar of one catastrophic personal failing, one tragically tangled consequence of his secret desires. An icy wave of panic, pure and overwhelming, washed over him, engulfing his consciousness entirely. This raw, primal fear was so potent, so all-consuming, that it brutally suppressed every other conflicting emotion. Any lingering traces of guilt over his infidelity, any flicker of paternal responsibility towards the unborn child, even the residual shadow of affection he might have once felt for Simone, or the deep, complex love he held for Elias, all were violently extinguished, incinerated in the furnace of his terror. In the distorted landscape of his fear-ravaged mind, Simone and Elias ceased to be individuals, ceased to be people he had cared for or was connected to. They transformed, instantaneously and horrifyingly, into abstract, insurmountable problems. They became direct, existential threats to his very survival, obstacles that had to be neutralized, removed from his path at any cost. He stood frozen, staring blankly through the expansive window of his chambers, the familiar panorama of the Oakland skyline and the distant gleam of the bay rendered meaningless. He caught his own reflection superimposed against the cityscape, the tailored suit, the stern lines of authority etched around his eyes and mouth. But the man staring back was a stranger. The composed, powerful jurist was gone, replaced by something else, something cornered and feral. The eyes held not wisdom or judiciousness, but raw, unadulterated fear. He saw a trapped animal, stripped of its dignity, ready to lash out with desperate violence to ensure its own preservation. The recognition, or rather the terrifying lack thereof, sent another jolt of cold through him. It was in this state of abject terror that the thought, monstrous and previously unthinkable, began to coalesce. It didn't arrive as a fully formed malevolent scheme, but rather emerged insidiously from the depths of his panic, like a predator surfacing from murky water. It presented itself not as a choice, but as a horrifying necessity, a dark, repellent imperative dictated by the overwhelming instinct for self-preservation. The idea of elimination, removing the threats, permanently. It was a solution born not of malice, but of sheer, unadulterated desperation. He felt the walls closing in, the weight of impending doom pressing down on him. There was no retreat, no way to undo what had been done, no path back to the safety of his former life. He stood teetering on the absolute edge of a precipice, the fall into ruin yawning beneath him. Retreat meant destruction, the only path his fear-crazed mind could perceive, the only direction that seemed to offer escape, led forward, directly into an abyss of profound darkness. He had to act immediately and decisively before the truth could escape its confinement and trigger the chain reaction that would annihilate his world. The plan began to assemble itself within the judge's mind, not with the heat of passion, but with a chilling, detached precision, much like constructing a complex legal argument designed to obscure an inconvenient truth. All warmth, all empathy, all connection had been cauterized by the white-hot flame of self-preservation. His thoughts moved with a frightening clarity, dissecting the problem, evaluating options, calculating risks. Survival was the only imperative, the only law he now recognized. The location required careful consideration. It needed isolation, plausibility for an accident, and a degree of natural hazard. His mind settled on Skyline Boulevard, the scenic but notoriously treacherous road winding along the crest of the Oakland Hills. Its dramatic vistas and hairpin turns were as well known as the frequent accidents that occurred there, particularly when the coastal fog rolled in or darkness fell. Cars plunging down the steep, chaparral-covered slopes were tragic but not uncommon occurrences, readily accepted explanations. Simone was the immediate priority, the more volatile element. He needed to lure her to the chosen spot. He crafted a pretext, appealing perhaps to her anxiety about the future, suggesting a crucial, private discussion away from prying ears. Maybe he offered the prospect of substantial financial support, a promise to take care of things, weaving a narrative that required this specific, secluded meeting place under the cover of evening. He set the time for dusk, when the fading light and lengthening shadows would provide cover, and the beauty of the panoramic view could serve as a disarming backdrop. He drove there well in advance, parking his own vehicle discreetly some distance away and walking back to the designated overlook. He scanned the area meticulously, his senses hyper-alert, noting the absence of other cars, hikers, or cyclists. The vastness of the view below, the sprawling lights of Oakland and Berkeley twinkling into existence as twilight deepened, felt alien and menacing. He waited, the silence broken only by the wind rustling through the eucalyptus trees and the distant hum of the city, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. Simone's modest car eventually pulled into the gravel turnout. She looked pale and uncertain as she got out. Their conversation was brief, stilted, fraught with the unspoken tension that hung heavy in the cool evening air. He kept his voice calm, reassuring, playing the part he had rehearsed, while his eyes constantly darted around, assessing the surroundings, waiting for the opportune moment. It came unexpectedly. Perhaps she turned back towards her car to retrieve something, a jacket against the chill, or maybe she simply shifted her weight, turning her back to the precipice for a second as she spoke. In that instant, instinct took over. There was no conscious decision, only a surge of raw, desperate impulse. He moved quickly, decisively, a firm, hard shove. A short, choked cry of surprise and terror abruptly cut off. The sickening sound of shifting gravel, followed by the crashing, tearing noise of the car rolling, tumbling down the steep embankment, punctuated by the sharp snaps of breaking branches, fading rapidly into the sudden, profound silence of the ravine below. He stood frozen for a beat, heart hammering against his ribs, straining his ears, expecting... What? A scream? Sirens? There was nothing but the wind. He forced himself to move, his actions mechanical. He scanned the overlook again, his gaze sweeping the road in both directions. Empty. He meticulously checked the ground where they had stood, scuffing out any distinct footprints, ensuring no personal item, no shred of evidence had been dropped. He walked briskly back to his hidden car, got in, and drove away, forcing himself to maintain a legal speed, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. A strange, discordant mix of sensations washed over him. A dizzying wave of relief so intense it felt like nausea, coupled with a deep, visceral horror at what he had just done. The adrenaline left a metallic taste in his mouth, a perverse echo of victory mingling with the bile of self-disgust. Now, Elias. A different approach was required here. Something less direct, less violent, something that wouldn't immediately connect to him or the recent accident. Suspicion had to be meticulously avoided. He knew his son's routines, his habits, the layout of his apartment near the Berkeley campus. He waited several days, allowing the initial shock of Simone's death to settle over the community, letting the narrative of a tragic accident take hold. Then, cloaked in the socially acceptable guise of a grieving father seeking comfort and connection with his bereaved son, who was also, everyone assumed, mourning Simone, Theodore Vance arranged a visit. He arrived at Elias's apartment bearing carefully chosen expressions of sorrow and concern. The performance was masterful. He spoke of Simone with regret, inquired about Elias's well-being, offered paternal support. During the visit, under the pretense of making coffee or fetching a glass of water, he found his moment. Perhaps Elias stepped out of the room briefly to take a call, or was distracted by a message on his phone. With swift, practiced movements, Vance acted. He might have added a potent, fast-acting substance, procured illicitly through channels his position could subtly access, to the drink he had prepared for his son. Or perhaps he located Elias's regular allergy medication or vitamins and deftly swapped the contents of the bottle with identical-looking capsules containing a lethal compound designed for delayed effect. He had carefully researched the dosage, aiming for a result that would mimic a sudden medical crisis or an accidental overdose hours later, long after he had departed, severing any temporal link. He stayed a respectable amount of time, playing his role to perfection before making his excuses. He left the apartment with a chillingly calm exterior, a heavy weight settling in his chest, but overlaid with the cold, hard certainty that the second and arguably greater threat to his existence had now been definitively neutralized. Two separate tragedies, unconnected except through the shared grief of one respected man. The perfect, terrible symmetry of it offered a sliver of grim satisfaction amidst the encroaching darkness. The news of the two sudden deaths, occurring in such swift and tragic succession, sent ripples of shock and dismay throughout Oakland and the wider East Bay community. First, the horrifying report of a vibrant young woman, Simone Dubois, losing her life in a terrible plunge from the perilous heights of Skyline Boulevard. Then, mere days later, the equally stunning news of the unexpected passing of Elias Vance, the promising and well-liked Berkeley student, the only son of the highly respected Judge Theodore Vance. The preliminary reports suggested a probable accidental overdose or perhaps an unforeseen, catastrophic medical event. The proximity of the tragedies, linked by the grieving figure of the judge, amplified the sense of communal sorrow and disbelief. Through this period of public mourning, Judge Vance navigated the intense scrutiny with a performance of profound grief that was nothing short of masterful. He projected the image of a heartbroken father, doubly bereaved, struggling stoically under an unimaginable weight of loss. He received the endless stream of condolences from colleagues, city officials, and community leaders with quiet dignity, his face a carefully composed mask of sorrow and resilience. He personally oversaw the arrangements for Elias's funeral, a somber, high-profile event attended by many of Oakland's elite. Standing before the assembled mourners, under the dim light of the chapel, he delivered a eulogy that was both poignant and controlled. Speaking of his son's bright future, tragically cut short, his voice thick with emotion, but never completely breaking. Tears tracked pathways down his cheeks, seemingly genuine, evoking waves of sympathy from those present. He was the very picture of noble suffering. However, behind the heavy, ornate doors of his stately Piedmont home, far from the sympathetic gazes and murmured condolences, a private hell had taken root. The quiet dignity evaporated the moment he was alone, replaced by a raw, consuming torment. Sleep offered no refuge. It had become a scarce commodity, fleeting and disturbed. When exhaustion finally claimed him, it brought only fragmented nightmares populated by the accusing eyes of Simone and the bewildered, trusting face of Elias. More often, he lay awake through the long, silent hours of the night, staring into the darkness, his mind a relentless carousel of guilt, fear, and recrimination. Every unexpected creak of the old house, every distant siren, every ring of the telephone sent jolts of pure, undiluted panic through him, his heart seizing in his chest. He began to see their faces in fleeting shadows, hear their voices in the sighing of the wind. He withdrew almost completely from his former social life, declining invitations, canceling long-standing engagements, citing his overwhelming grief as an understandable excuse. He attended only the most unavoidable public functions required by his position, moving through them like an automaton, his presence detached, his interactions brief and strained. The constant effort of maintaining the facade of the grieving father, while simultaneously wrestling with the monstrous reality of his actions, began to exact a visible toll. Subtle cracks appeared in his carefully constructed composure, hairline fractures almost imperceptible to casual observers, but potentially revealing to a keener eye. There was a new remoteness in his gaze, moments of unnerving distraction where his attention would drift mid-conversation. A persistent tremor sometimes afflicted his hands, particularly when reaching for a glass or signing a document. An air of profound, bone-deep weariness settled upon him, a fatigue that no amount of rest seemed to alleviate. It was within this atmosphere of carefully managed grief and simmering suspicion that Detective Lena Holloway, a seasoned investigator with the Oakland Police Department, known for her sharp mind and meticulous approach, was assigned the task of formally reviewing and closing the file on Elias Vance's death. On the surface, it appeared straightforward. Compile the reports, confirm the medical examiner's findings of probable accidental overdose, finalize the paperwork. Yet as she sifted through the preliminary documents, a persistent, low-level hum of professional unease began to resonate within her. Something felt slightly discordant. Two deaths, both sudden and unexpected, occurring within days of each other, both individuals tangentially or directly connected to the same prominent, powerful family. She knew Judge Vance by reputation and through occasional professional interactions. She respected his position, his intellect. But years on the force had honed her intuition, teaching her to trust the subtle dissonances, the details that didn't quite align. Operating initially below the official radar, driven more by instinct than concrete evidence, Detective Holloway began to quietly probe the periphery of the cases. She didn't launch a formal investigation, not yet, but she started asking discreet questions, reviewing timelines, cross-referencing witness accounts from Simone's accident with the circumstances surrounding Elias's death. She spent hours poring over the toxicology reports again, scrutinizing the autopsy findings for Elias, rereading the accident reconstruction report from Skyline Boulevard. There were no glaring inconsistencies, no smoking gun. The official narratives held together, plausible and supported by the initial findings. Yet the feeling of Nadaskazanist, that sense of something crucial left unsaid, deliberately obscured, only intensified. The polished surface of the official story felt too smooth, too neat. The gilded, orderly life of Judge Theodore Vance, once a symbol of stability and success, had become irrevocably tarnished from within, hollowed out by his secrets. The brilliant sun of his long career was undeniably beginning its descent, obscured not by the natural passage of time, but by the dark, heavy clouds of inescapable guilt and the ever-present chilling fear of discovery. The relentless passage of time offered Judge Theodore Vance no respite. Instead, it served only to amplify the internal pressure cooker of his guilt and terror. The strain manifested in increasingly noticeable ways, chipping away at the smooth veneer he struggled desperately to maintain. He became prone to uncharacteristic lapses in concentration during court proceedings, his mind clearly elsewhere. Casual conversations with colleagues became minefields, where an innocuous question might trigger a disproportionately defensive or irritable response. He made small, unsettling errors in recounting details related to the period surrounding Elias's and Simone's deaths. Minor inconsistencies that might have been dismissed as grief-induced confusion in isolation, but began to form a subtle pattern. The disciplined control that had defined his career started to fray visibly at the edges. Sleep deprivation etched dark circles beneath his eyes, and the tremor in his hands became more pronounced, less easily concealed. Meanwhile, Detective Lena Holloway refused to let her initial unease fade. While lacking the concrete evidence needed to secure warrants or compel formal testimony from the well-protected judge, she continued her quiet, methodical work, operating on the periphery, driven by a deepening conviction that the official narratives were incomplete, perhaps deliberately misleading. She revisited the burner phone angle. Painstaking backtracking and analysis of cell tower data, combined with diligent legwork checking small convenience stores far from Vance's usual haunts, eventually led her to a store owner who vaguely recalled selling a cheap, untraceable phone, matching the description around the relevant time frame to a well-dressed man paying cash. A description that could fit the judge, though it was far from conclusive. Crucially, records placed the anonymous call to Simone's cell phone mere hours before her fatal drive up Skyline Boulevard, originating from a location consistent with the areas Vance frequented outside his official duties. She also revisited the pharmacy near the Berkeley campus. The pharmacist remained hesitant, intimidated by the judge's status, but Holloway's patient, persistent questioning eventually yielded a slightly more detailed, though still tentative, recollection. He remembered a distinguished-looking man bearing a resemblance to Judge Vance, inquiring about, or perhaps purchasing without a prescription, a specific potent sedative, or perhaps even a cardiac medication known to be dangerous if misused. The pharmacist couldn't be absolutely certain of the man's identity or the exact drug, but the timing coincided disturbingly with the days leading up to Elias's death. When cross-referenced with the toxicology report, which had noted trace amounts of an unexpected substance initially dismissed as insignificant or contamination, this vague memory began to acquire a more sinister weight. The individual pieces remained circumstantial, weak on their own, but woven together, they started to form a troubling tapestry of coincidence and suspicion. Holloway knew it wasn't enough for an indictment, but she felt it was finally enough to force a direct confrontation. She requested a meeting with Judge Vance, choosing, quite deliberately, the imposing setting of his own chambers within the Alameda County Courthouse, the very seat of his power and authority, the room that had for so long symbolized his apparent invulnerability. The heavy oak door closed behind her, muffling the sounds from the corridor, creating an atmosphere of intense intimacy and gravity. She laid out her findings calmly, dispassionately, presenting the timeline, the phone records, the pharmacist's hesitant statement, the anomalies in the toxicology reports. She spoke not in accusations, but in terms of unresolved questions, troubling coincidences, and inconsistencies that strained credulity. She meticulously detailed the proximity of the deaths, the judge's known connections to both victims, the potential conflicts that might arise from these connections. Initially, Theodore Vance reacted with practiced indignation, the imperious demeanor of the bench firmly in place. He dismissed her concerns as speculative, unfounded, bordering on harassment. He cited his profound grief, the stress he was under, the possibility of errors in her investigation or misinterpretations of benign events. He attempted to control the narrative, to steer the conversation back to the established conclusions of accidental death. But Holloway watched him closely, noting the subtle tells beneath the judicial bluster, the slight sheen of perspiration on his forehead, despite the room's cool temperature, the restless tapping of his fingers on the polished desk, the way his eyes darted away from her steady gaze. She held her ground, patiently letting his denials hang in the air before pressing forward. Then carefully, choosing her words with precision, she shifted to the question of motive. She spoke softly about the persistent rumors, whispers she had picked up through discreet inquiries concerning his relationship with Simone Dubois. She mentioned the unconfirmed but widely speculated upon matter of Simone's pregnancy. She didn't state it as fact, but posed it as a potential complicating factor, a hidden pressure point that might connect the two seemingly separate tragedies. It was this, the introduction of the secret that lay at the heart of his terror, the potential unmasking of the very reason for his monstrous acts, that finally broke him. The carefully constructed dam of his composure didn't just crack, it shattered completely. The indignant denial vanished, replaced by a sudden raw vulnerability. It wasn't a calculated decision to confess. It was an implosion, an uncontrollable outpouring of the guilt, fear, and despair that had been consuming him from within. The words tumbled out in a torrent, fragmented at first, then gaining a desperate coherence. He spoke of the paralyzing fear of scandal, the terror of losing everything he had worked for, the crushing weight of exposure. He confessed to luring Simone to Skyline Boulevard, describing the shove, the sound of the car falling into the darkness. He spoke of visiting Elias, the unbearable necessity of silencing his own son, detailing the chillingly calculated act of poisoning him under the guise of fatherly concern. He spoke of the cold, methodical planning giving way to the endless, suffocating horror of the aftermath. He wept, not necessarily tears of remorse, but the racking sobs of a man utterly broken by the consequences of his own actions, stripped bare of all pretense. He confessed everything, there in the very room where he had presided over countless trials, weighed evidence, pronounced judgment upon others. The irony was stark, devastating. The seat of justice had become the scene of his own self-condemnation. His subsequent arrest, conducted quietly but firmly within the courthouse walls, sent shockwaves through Oakland, across California, and resonated deeply within the national legal community. The fall of Judge Theodore Vance, once a revered figure, a living embodiment of law and order, was swift, brutal, and absolute. The respected jurist was revealed as a ruthless killer, driven by fear and selfishness to commit the ultimate betrayal. The brilliant sun of his career and reputation was extinguished forever, leaving behind only the cold ashes of ruined lives and a dark, enduring echo of tragedy hanging over the picturesque Oakland hills.